good place where truth and integrity meet. Every week, I introduce you to thought provoking and compelling premier educators, whistleblowers, best selling authors, journalists, activists, and celebrities. And they all have one thing in common: they are people of truth and integrity, and many are considered modern day heroes. I have with me today a remarkable woman. Her name is Polly Franks, and Polly has served as an advocate for victims of violent crimes with a focus on childhood sexual assault abuse since 1995. She is the executive director of the Franks Foundation, which she created to help protect children from sexual predators. Her commitment to this cause stems from her experience as the mother of two children who were victimized by a former neighbor and family friend who turned out to be a convicted serial predator from another state. During his crime spree between 1982 and 1998, this predator was linked to a minimum of 286 incidents of sexual crimes. Although she's in a wheelchair, Polly became a licensed private investigator for the sole purpose of bringing this predator to justice. Since that time, she has testified before Congress and lobbied on Capitol Hill for tougher sex offender laws, such as the nationwide Amber Alert Bill and the Adam Walsh Child Protection Act. Polly has been interviewed by The Today Show, Dateline NBC, 2020, Court TV, The John Walsh Show, ABC World News Tonight, CNN, The Montel Williams Show, Nancy Grace, and Fox News. In addition, she has given numerous interviews for national radio programs, such as ours, as well as newspaper and magazine articles. She has shared her story to audiences throughout the country. And in 2017, her story was published in a nonfiction book titled Devil at My Door, available on Amazon. Polly is a graduate of Bluefield College. She is the very proud mother of three grown daughters, one child, a menagerie of animals, her four-legged children, and a host of honorary sons and daughters. So, Polly, thank you. I'm honored to have you on today.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
Okay. And I just want to tell everybody, if you're concerned about child abuse in this country, you really need to listen to this interview. And when I post it, I highly suggest you share it with anybody, mothers, families, just anybody who's concerned for children. And I think, one of the things I want to do, because we only have an hour, I want to jump right into your story. And I know this must be painful to discuss. I understand that. But I would like to hear the details of the crimes that were committed against your children so people can understand what you and your children went through. And you and I both know that talking about this topic and sharing your story is paramount in bringing awareness in order to protect children. And your story makes it real.
Right. Okay. Well, we had known this man for years, and his daughter was in first grade with my daughter. In 1995, his wife got up in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom and caught him naked and masturbating over the children while they were asleep. She threw him out of the house and divorced him, which to me was the only thing she could have done. But anyway, it began this long odyssey of trying to get the law enforcement to do what I assumed they were going to do. To me, this was clearly a no-brainer. The man was obviously a pedophile. When we went to court, they decided to make a deal, which infuriated me. I'm amazed I didn't give myself a stroke. I was so angry. And I just knew letting him go was a mistake. And while I was in the district attorney's office, she told me that this man, Joseph Frank Smith is his name, and he had had a rape conviction in another state. So they already knew this. And I was stunned because I was realizing this isn't just one small-time pervert. This is somebody with a long history that I have been friends with and had no idea. So it took 3 years to bring him to justice. It was a very, very long struggle. One day I called the Virginia State Police to tell them about this person, and they refused to take the information from me because they said he has a right to privacy. And to which I responded in words I will not use on your show. But it didn't go well. I was just stunned. I called the local counties. I was told when they let him go that they were going to watch him like a hawk, and I had nothing to worry about. Well, a week or two later, my neighbor was up in the middle of the night and saw him in my yard. And so I called the district attorney's office, and they called me back and said, well, we questioned him, and he said he didn't do it. And I'm like, well, of course he said he didn't do it, but so that's what I was up against. So they had told me they were going to watch him, but then when I talked to the DA, she's like, she didn't even know who it was that's supposed to be doing the watching.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, oh, my Lord. I mean, I know they're very busy people, but this is insane. This is a clear-cut crime. It's not one of those gray areas. So I was so frustrated, and knowing my physical condition, I knew I could never become a cop. So I decided to become
Because you're in a wheelchair.
Yes, and I decided to become a licensed private investigator. So to learn how to basically stalk the stalker, and like I said, it took 3 years of off and on. Sometimes nothing would happen, and then things would happen. And it's one thing I explain in detail in Devil at My Door, the things that I was taught by my private investigator instructor, who was also a police officer. Things you can and cannot do, things that are legal and things that can get you in trouble. One thing I learned is that, and you may know this already, but one thing I learned is that you can go through, if somebody's put their trash out, that's actually public domain, and you can get it. And as disgusting as that sounds, a person's life really is in their trash. It tells you who's living there, if they're on any kind of medication, if there's a baby in the house. There's any number of things that you can learn about that. And this, like I said, this was back in the mid to late 90s, and so a lot of people didn't shred their documents. So I was able to find out some things. The disadvantage was this was before the Internet became what it is today. So getting information was really difficult. And he was blessed with a very generic name, Joseph Smith. So it was very, very hard. I would call the sheriff's office of different counties, and a few of them took the information. Another sheriff's office in Richmond City was sympathetic, but he was basically a good old boy, and saying, don't you worry, one of these days he's going to stick his head in the wrong window and going to get it shot off. And I'm like, well, okay, but how many more children are going to be assaulted before that happens? So it was extremely frustrating. One thing that my instructor, whose name was Ed Beach, one thing Ed told me was, he said, addicts are their own worst enemy. This is the ultimate addiction, and he will do himself in. He will make it easier for you than you think. So when I took the PI class, I thought, kind of obvious. I don't really blend in, and I can't run and all of this. And he said, that is the perfect cover. He said, women are better private investigators than men usually because people trust them more. You could walk with your dog. You can, look like you're pregnant. You could. The possibilities are endless, and people will not take a second look at you, as opposed to a man walking around where he's not supposed to be. People get suspicious. So it never occurred to me that having a disability would be advantageous, but it turned out to be that way. So one of the reasons for writing Devil at My Door was to inform the reader some of the things that I learned, had to learn through classroom instruction and experience, and just to learn how to empower yourself, how to not be a victim, or if you are a victim, how to fight back and give them encouragement to fight back. But it's been an uphill battle, which really surprised me for what I felt was a very clear-cut issue of sex crimes against children by anyone's measure, unless you're a sex criminal, is clearly wrong, is illegal, and dangerous. And I had no idea that this no-brainer issue was going to be so much trouble. When this began, I knew it was a terrible shock that our friend was not the man I thought he was. and I knew I had a battle against him, but I never expected to have a two-pronged battle, one with him and one with law enforcement. It never occurred to me. So anyway, that's how the whole thing began. And gradually we find out more and more, and it wasn't for a couple of years that I learned the complete
Can I
extent
ask you a couple questions before we go on? I just wanted to know, what was your impression of him when you first met him? And when you discovered what he was doing, did you talk about it with your children?
Yes. To meet him, and you hear people say this on TV all the time, he seemed like such a nice guy. And Joseph Frank Smith seemed like a very nice guy. He was very polite, very soft-spoken. You could kind of tell he'd had a rough life, but he was a hard worker and had a nice home, and so just seemed very loving and caring of his children, and just a helpful neighbor and friend. Seemed to be a very involved father. So since this was just prior to the passage of Megan's Law, we had no way of knowing his history. So we knew him for years before we detected anything. We knew that there had been a lot of sex crimes in the neighborhood, break-ins and rapes and children being sexually assaulted. And, of course, the neighborhood was fearful, as were we, but it never occurred to me that this was somebody that I knew. My home, I was always very protective of my children and the home, and my late husband used to call it Fort Knox because always at night I locked up everything, turned on the outside lights, and all of that. And despite all of that, I let one of America's most prolific sexual predators through my front door. He knew the layout of my home. So when I found this out, I was in a great, as I'm sure you can imagine, a great deal of shock. I was just stunned. The words, it's like when you find out that someone you love has died suddenly. You're hearing the words, but they don't make sense, and it takes a little while for it to soak into your brain. I was, of course, horrified because my children had been over to that house for sleepovers dozens of times. And I had always told my children, you can always tell me anything. You can always tell me anything. And they had never said anything. So anyway, the next morning, I didn't say anything to them that night because I knew I was too upset, and I didn't want to make the situation worse by getting emotional in front of them and scaring them. They were ages 8 and 9 at the time. So the next morning, I called their pediatrician, who had been my pediatrician, actually. So I've known this man for decades. And I said, what do I do? And he said, just, sort of surreptitiously check and make sure there's no swelling or redness in their private area, and no sudden change in behavior, no sudden, emotional upsets that had not been there before. He says, if you suspect anything, bring them into me and I'll check them out. I also called the principal of the school where my children attended, as did Smith's daughter was a student there as well. I was very put out because when I told the principal, this guy's a pedophile, by the way, they were like, well, until we get a police report, we can't keep him off the school campus. And I'm like, oh, isn't that nice? You got hundreds of elementary school kids right here, and because of a technicality in the law, you don't want to be rude and keep him off the campus. But I was running basically on emotion at the time. So
I would have become livid. I can only imagine how you felt when they said that.
Like everything was about his rights and his privacy and all of that, which infuriated me. I was like, what about my kids? They're 8 and 9 years old. And what about us? So I also talked to their guidance counselor at school. And so she and I talked, and so she would talk to the girls, and then I would talk to the girls, and we would compare notes. And so we did. I talked to them together, and I didn't tell them too much because at that age they didn't even know what sex was. And I certainly didn't want them to find out this way. through something ugly. So I would just ask him, I said, Mr. Smith has left the house. They're getting divorced. Have you seen anything? Has he ever touched you? Has he ever done anything that makes you feel weird or uncomfortable? Is there anything that you don't like about him? And they said absolutely, there's no problem. They didn't see anything. And so I would waited a couple of weeks, and I asked them individually. And the same story. They didn't notice anything. So, and my oldest daughter, who was 15, had been the family babysitter. So I gave her more information about that and grilled her, and she said no. If she'd ever seen anything, she would have reported it. So I was relieved at that, but it wasn't over because they gave him a suspended sentence. We got a restraining order, which was not worth the paper it was written on, and which they wouldn't enforce. So it was just infuriating and frightening.
It really sounds like it. Sounds absolutely frightening. And so let's talk about how you proceeded legally with this matter. And I'd like to hear, what did you find out? You became a private investigator and you started to find things out. Was it the wife that approached you about this? Am I correct? His wife?
The wife told my husband. I was not home, hadn't gotten back from work, so she told my husband. They had it, when the kids weren't around, and she told him exactly what had happened. However, she didn't. She told me this. She told us this on a Monday evening, and this had happened during early morning hours of the prior Saturday. So she waited a couple of days to tell us, which was odd. But she was very teary and apologetic and promised that she had never known anything about him having any kind of tendencies like that she would have never, ever exposed my children to any kind of danger. And not knowing better, I believed her, and I felt very sorry for her. And I was even defending her to national media. I was defending her to the neighbors. I was defending her to everybody.
When you said the national media, when did they pick up this story? How did you become such a public figure?
Well, it wasn't the national media picked it up in 1998, and I was actually having a pre-interview with Dateline NBC, and I was, again, they were saying, like, how can you be friends with her and all of this, and I was like, well, as far as I could tell, she had done everything right. She'd thrown him out. She'd gotten divorced. So I found out, ironically, the person who put those two things together was a reporter with the Washington Post who realized that San Antonio's ski mask rapist from 1983 was Richmond, Virginia's bandana bandit in 1996. So that's when it really hit the fan, and so Dateline and 2020 and they jump on that, absolutely. Which is a mixed blessing. They do need to jump on it, but I had to really work to protect my children and to protect his.
Mm-hmm. I understand that. And what about his children? Did you ever find out if there was any abuse towards his own children?
I am 99% sure that there was, and the only reason I say 99% was because I wasn't there to see it, and there hasn't been a report filed. But yes, I absolutely have reason to believe that both of those girls, they were ages 3 and 9, and just with behaviors later, I just realized, and the mother was a psychiatric nurse, and so I told her what I was seeing, and she just said, well, I've asked them, and they said nothing happened, so that's that. She just wanted it all to be over, which I understand. It was a nightmare, but I was, really frustrated because she seemed to be indulging herself, getting the answers that she wanted from her children and not digging any deeper. So that became a problem as well.
Mm-hmm. And then you discovered all these additional crimes that he had committed. When was he finally taken in? When was he finally arrested?
He was arrested in 1998. I get a telephone. I had cultivated a what do you call it? The DA's office, a low level, meaning a clerical person who knew what was going on but wasn't above the radar. And so I was contacted and said he just got arrested. And so, well, part of me was like very glad, and then part of me was like, what's going on? So this was in a neighboring county in Chesterfield, Virginia. Maddeningly, I call Chesterfield, and I found out that they had not only let him post bail, but they had failed to get the name and contact information for the person who had posted bail, and they didn't know where he was. They were asking me if I knew where he was. And I'm like, no. So it was just that kind of thing. And like I said, the media was a mixed blessing. It's a great tool for getting the word out and telling more people in 2 minutes than you can tell people in a lifetime. But you do have to set boundaries. They wanted pictures of my children. They wanted to talk to my children. And I just absolutely said no.
I can understand that. And what were some of the other obstacles that occurred? You've touched upon it briefly, but I'm just curious because I know this was a long road for you.
What other obstacles?
What other obstacles came about in the process of trying to get him arrested and have a criminal case filed against him, and eventually leading to incarceration?
Well, one of the obstacles was, which I really to this day don't understand, when he was arrested for what had happened with my children. The police knew, and they had already named somebody the Bandana Bandit. They knew it was in that neighborhood. They didn't know what it was, who he was. And there had been some sex crimes with some DNA taken from other victims, from 2 5-year-old girls. And when they arrested him, they knew his history at that time, a lot more about his history than I did, and they never took any DNA. If they had taken that, he would have been off the streets then. But because they didn't do that, for reasons I will never understand, there were more victims. The victims just pile up. So that was an obstacle. Another obstacle was friends and family who were, and I understand they were trying to calm me down, but they were saying that I was obsessed. I needed to just let it go and forgive him. If I was a good Christian, I would forgive him, that kind of thing, which was comical because this was coming from people who would get upset over much less things. So that was an obstacle as well. And just trying to balance that with not neglecting my children and my husband and my home and everything else. So it was very difficult.
Mm-hmm. I imagine so. And did you find out details about any of the other crimes committed against children?
That he committed?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yes. Like I said, there were 2 5-year-old girls that they had the DNA on that linked him. Once they finally took DNA from him in 1998, 3 years later. But yes, there were. So he had also raped adult women.
Oh, okay, that's what I was curious about. That's what I was very
His preference was the younger the better. But he would, in a pinch, he would rape a woman. So it was in Texas back in '83. They'd had a big trial, and it had caused a big stink down there. People were furious because when they put him as a ski mask rapist on trial in Texas, they put him on probation even after a woman that he had raped twice was testifying against him. They decided that he was not a bad person. He was a good person who did bad things, and that he needed psychiatric help, not to be punished in jail. And You could almost laugh if the results weren't so horrible.
Mhm.
He went to Johns Hopkins University Hospital, was treated by a specialist who was an MD and a PhD, who gave him chemical castration injections of Depo-Provera, which is a female contraceptive, but it's supposed to cause impotence in a man. And that whole theory was based upon the fact.
We'll be right back after these commercial messages, so hang on. Well, welcome back, everybody. So we'll just pick up here with Polly Franks, the author of The Devil at the Door, and we were discussing the criminal and the mastermind that was a child predator. And we were talking about this idea of castration through female hormones. So let's pick up where we left off.
Sure. It was based on the premise that sexual assaults were because of high testosterone levels, which even back in the day, I knew that was not true. It's about anger and control. And making a predator impotent isn't going to make him any less dangerous. It's just going to make him angry and frustrated. It was insane. He was supposed to have that for 10 years. And I bet about 3.5 or 4 years after he began this treatment, during which, by the way, he fathered 2 children, the doctor released him from the program and said, if you have any problems, report by mail, which to me sounded like, okay, if you rape anybody, just send us a postcard. It was ludicrous. I could not believe these highly educated people just could not see the obvious. So that was what we were up against. The defense attorney in the Texas case had the audacity to go on 60 Minutes back in 1983 and say that this had only been a mild rape, so it really wasn't that bad for the victim.
I'm sure there was quite a bit of a lashback after that, or backlash.
Oh, absolutely. But that's and these are educated professional people saying these things, which is what you're up against. It was like, the ignorance was just overwhelming. It just frustrated me to no end. But after the case in 98, where he was given life without parole, plus 40 years, I was assured by the DA that he was never getting out, because when she said, after the sentencing was over, I came up to her and I said, okay, so what does life without parole actually mean? 5 years, 10 years? She said, no, it's life means life, and he's never, ever going to get out, which was very reassuring. And so as my crime victim advocacy grew, I would make a point of trying to help people who had predators who were coming out for parole, all the while thinking that I was so fortunate that I didn't have to go through that. We would do parole block letters to different parole boards for different cases that came up all over the country, getting people involved, and especially letting the communities get involved when they found out that someone's getting ready to be cut loose in their backyard. So it became a big part of my life, and I had the absolute privilege of meeting a lot of people whose stories were far, far worse than mine, and they inspired me because they kept on going, and they had turned these horrible tragedies into opportunities to help other people.
Mm-hmm. I see that all the time, and it's very inspiring, like you said. But one of the things I did want to address as well, we had discussed this via email, was these other issues that are coming up, like geriatric consideration in Virginia, and I know that's going on in many other states. And basically, you can begin to apply for you can apply for this care, and it can actually get you out of the system. They can start applying when they're 60 years old.
Yes, and by today's standards, 60 is not geriatric.
Not at all, like 80 maybe. Mm-hmm.
And secondly, these they're in there for life without, for a purpose, for a reason. And there are some people, thirdly, there's some people who are just not safe at any age. We've seen cases in the news where there was one a few months ago where a judge let a 70-year-old man go because he said, you're too old to hurt anybody, and he turned around and shot a woman in front of her children, shot her dead. So the age thing is ludicrous.
Not to mention, they don't deserve to be out in the real world in the comforts of the real world. Like, some of these crimes are beyond, they're just horrific. It's like you said, I like that word, the devil at my door, because these people, they're so, the antithesis of a warm, caring, evolved human being. So they are a danger, and they should have to serve their sentence. And I know it costs the states a lot of money, but they don't deserve to have the comforts of home and to be out in the real world.
Well, I had signed up for this victim notification with the Virginia Department of Corrections to receive notifications if anything was going on with him, if he was being moved to a different prison and that type of thing. So one day I got a letter, and I'd actually told somebody a few days earlier that every time I would get that letter with that return address, I would stop breathing for a second. It was just taking me back. So I almost didn't open this letter, but I opened it up, and it was a letter informing me that this man was now eligible for parole under geriatric consideration. 286 sexual assaults at least, life without parole plus 40 years, and now he's eligible because he's turned 60. And I cannot tell you in words how traumatic that was. It was PTSD inducing. I was having nightmares, screaming nightmares, and it was just horrendous. So every 3 years we go through that, and we fight it. And everyone around me, assures me, well, they're never going to let him out. They would never, But having seen this man do cartwheels through the criminal justice system, I am not going to leave anything to chance, because he knows how to fool psychiatrists, he knows how to fool probation officers, and I am just not
he's a
going to leave
psychopath. Yeah, he knows how to manipulate people.
And so I am not, as long as he and I are still alive, I'm going to be there to fight this every 3 years. It's very stressful, but somebody's got to do it, and somebody needs to remind the parole board every 3 years of just how despicable this person is, and just what a danger he really is.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things I guess we can progress to is your foundation. I would love for you to share with our listeners information about it. When did it start? How did you decide to start this organization? And what is the mission? Which seems very obvious, but I'll turn it over to you to answer.
Oh, sure. We started the Franks Foundation, which basically kept it simple. We just dedicated to help protecting America's children from sexual predators. Now, since in the last couple of years, because of the illness and death of my husband, I'm sorry to say it did get on the back. The foundation was put on the back burner. I'm sorry to hear
that, by the way. I am sorry to hear that. Sorry for your loss.
Thank you. But because of that, it had to be put on the back burner. But I'm, the year 2020 is a rebuilding year, and so my goal is to have it up and running again. When it was running, we helped over 1,500 children. We provide comfort kits, what we call comfort kits, and stuffed animals for sexually abused children in hospital emergency rooms. And the comfort kits happen to have blank pads of paper with either crayons or markers, depending upon the age of the child, and we wrap it up in a child-themed pillowcase. So the child can actually use the pillowcase to carry everything home or wherever they're going to be. So it gives them a chance to tell their story, and many times they would take the district attorney would take these pictures as evidence when they were trying these perps. Mm-hmm. So it was good for the nurses who were trying to get information from these traumatized children, because nobody's ever in the emergency room because they're having a good day. Um, nobody for any reason, and for a child, it's that much worse.
And it
But
is
it
really horrible what they do when they go to the hospital and they're trying to obtain DNA samples. It's not a pleasant. I watched a brief documentary on it, and it's so that in itself is so frightening.
Well, what they would do was the child would pick the stuffed animal of their choice, so they have a little bit of control in this terrible situation, and then the nurse would show the child with the stuffed animal how he or she was going to be examined, and it would also offer the child a chance, using the stuffed animal, to tell authorities how and where they had been hurt. So it kind of put a comforting layer between having to talk to complete strangers that the child does not know.
Mm.
So anyway, like I said, we're working to get it back up. It just there's so much other things going on that I had to put that aside temporarily. But it was we went to a lot of hospitals, mostly in Virginia, but also in New York and Alaska, California, many places. And the nurses were just so appreciative of having that, because it was such a tool to help them. So it helped the children, helped the nurses, helped the law enforcement with something very low tech, very simple.
Mm-hmm. And what do you suggest to people? What are the best resources for people to educate themselves and to bring awareness of what they need to look for?
Okay, the first thing I tell people always is to check your sex offender registry. Now, you can do that. There's a nationwide registry, which is what I usually give when I'm on the media, because people are everywhere. It's familywatchdog.us, and it's a nationwide sex offender registry. Find out who's in your neighborhood. Find out who is in the neighborhood of your child's school. Find out who is in the babysitter's neighborhood. Wherever your child is going to be spending a tremendous amount of time, if you have a church, find out who lives in that neighborhood. You cannot, the police at their very best can't be everywhere, and there are too many predators for them to monitor. So if we had access to that, then certainly Joseph Frank Smith would have never come near my children if we had that information to begin with. But you cannot tell by looking. And so I cannot tell you the number of people who have looked on this website and found, a rapist across the street, or, somebody who's been paroled, that kind of thing. And it's a tool to use so that you can be wary and be careful and not let them have access to your children. That's the first thing. Another thing I tell people is listen to your kids. A small child is not supposed to know about sexual issues, and if they're talking about it or acting it out, they've heard it from someone else, an older person, and they need to be believed. Even if you suspect your child may be making it up, it's far better to err on the side of caution than to not believe the child. I can't tell you the emails that I've received from people whose their mothers and grandmothers and people would refuse to believe when they would tell them, because this predator happened to be, the family pastor or the coach or Uncle David or whomever, and there's there's no way, because he's not a creepy guy in a trench coat hanging out at the playground. This is a good person, and I think we've seen with the Bill Cosby case that this literally can be, a predator can be anyone, anywhere, in any economic level.
Mm-hmm. And we talked before yesterday, I believe it was yesterday, the day before, about my own experience. And I was one of those people where my mother didn't believe me because it was a family, it was a step grandfather. And I came forward and she just she was in denial. It's just funny to watch her body. No. Like she was in complete denial. That's just not true. Not true. you know. And the other incident that had happened to me when I was 7, they did believe I was on my way to school and this guy in a car basically tried to kidnap me, and he was naked and he was masturbating. So the fact that I said what is, I went to the school and I was just deeply, I got away. And so I went to the school and I told the teacher, and because I said white stuff was coming out of his private, there was white stuff, you know, they knew I was telling the truth, because how would I have known that? So
Right, right. Yeah, the fact that your family believes that, it's so much easier to believe that it's a stranger than it is
exactly.
somebody within your circle, a family of friends. Um, what the fact is that 90% of sexually abused children know their abuser. It's
Hmm.
because predators usually go after what is most convenient, who's nearest, and and they also look for vulnerable children. You know, if the parents are combative or whatever may be going on, they know how to pounce on that. Um, so it drives me crazy. But I always tell people it's so much better to believe them, and then if you find out you're wrong later, you find out you're wrong. But take it to the next step and investigate and find out what's going on,
Hmm.
because they wouldn't just say this for no good reason, especially very young children. They have no idea. Um, but it is so much easier to assume that your child is lying than it is to open up this whole can of worms within your family or within your church or within your neighborhood. It's so much easier just to assume the child is making it up.
And it causes shame. There's something, instead, like when I was little and it was addressed, my mother actually was very actively involved to keep this from happening. She helped set up block parents, and back in the day, you basically, neighbors would get together, neighbors that were trusted, and you would put a letter outside your window, just said block parent, and then there was a letter, and that was a safe house if something was happening. And so she was very involved, and became, got to know all the neighbors, and they all worked together to prevent this from happening to another child. So that was great. But then what happened as a teenager, when I finally came clean, that it did something to me. It really did. Like, you can't be honest. And I became ashamed. And it's just, yeah, if you're a parent, please listen to your child. I know kids do make things up, they want attention, but what if they're telling the truth? It is just devastating to a young person to not be believed over something so horrific.
Absolutely. People want to believe, like I said, that this is some spooky, creepy guy off in the shadows behind the bushes. They don't want to think that this is somebody who may be at their church or within their family or in their, very nice, polite neighbor who's got keeps his grass cut and is, very friendly. They don't want to believe that it's that. They want to separate themselves and believe that this is, the bad people who live away from where we live. Um, it's when I tell people about looking up the FamilyWatchdog.us website, and I tell them, people like to think that the predators are all in the bad part of town. They're on the other side of the tracks. They're not where we live. We have a nice neighborhood, and that has nothing to do with it. That is, I'm sorry to say, that is not a protection. Predators come in all colors, sizes, professions. It could be literally anyone.
Mhm. And yeah, you're absolutely right about that. It's like we were talking about yesterday. It's kind of like alcoholism. Every socio-economic group, it really is, in every community. And I did too. I looked at the registry, and there wasn't one very close. The closest, but then again, when you look, you're not sure what that means. I mean, because sometimes, oh, well, this 19-year-old was dating a 16-year-old. So you never really know that much about it. Maybe you can click on it to find out their history, their criminal history a little closer. Is that what you can do?
Well, on Family Watchdog, what you can do is they give what the charges were, what the convictions
Okay.
are. These aren't just some whose ex has gotten mad at them. These are people who've been through the criminal justice system,
Hmm.
and so that, and it's public information. So you can find out basically what they are. And for the record, I'm very much against, the 19-year-old who's in love with a 17-year-old. I don't think that person should be going to prison for 40 years just because they've got charged up hormones. If it's consensual, that to me, justice is not being served. And it's certainly not being served if an innocent person goes to prison. So, but with DNA now, we have such a tool that nails it down so precisely. I just think half the battle is knowledge, is knowing. I had a coworker years ago who told me she did not need to look up this registry because she lived in a very nice neighborhood and had very nice neighbors. When she was finally persuaded to look it up, she had 15 child molesters who lived within a mile of her house. And she turned several shades of white when she discovered that, when she got off her high horse and realized she needed to be a little more tuned in to the real world.
Yeah, people don't want to know the truth sometimes, and we just can't do that. By denying what's real or not facing it, you could be endangering people around you. Without awareness, it's much more easy for things to go on, crimes to be committed if there's little awareness, and it's just putting on these blinders of not wanting to see it and listen to it.
Absolutely.
It's up to us.
Denial.
Yeah,
Denial is pretty much the biggest challenge our children have to being safe. That more than anything. The parents who want to keep their head in the sand and refuse to believe that this exists, they're endangering their children. I'm not saying you have to be, totally obsessed, but for heaven's sakes, find out who's in your neighborhood, who's in the babysitter's neighborhood, who's in grandma's neighborhood, just so you can be informed.
Yeah, and we just have like 5 more minutes, but I wanted to go through some of the statistics. And to me, the statistics are going to be on the lower side because not everybody comes forward. But so that is an issue. But let's see here. Child sexual abuse statistics, they vary. So the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services Children's Bureau reported child maltreatment, found that 9.2% of victimized children were sexually assaulted. And then studies by David Finkelor, director of the Crimes Against Children Research Center, show that 1 in 5 girls and 1 out of 20 boys is a victim of child sexual abuse. That's really high.
It is, and I actually heard a higher instance for the boys as being about 1 in 5. But I mean, I don't know that for I could not.
It's hard to find out. Yes, we don't really know for sure.
It's easy to say, and for anybody out there who's listening, that's roughly 20% of the population. And if this has happened to you, you are not alone, and you need to stop blaming yourself and feeling embarrassed. It's long past time we took the embarrassment and shame from the victim and put it where it belongs, on the predator.
Yeah, it is not your fault if this has happened to you, and somehow you carry that as if you had something to do with it, but it is not your fault. And I think it's just so important for people to understand that and turn the shame and the guilt into empowerment. Do something about it. Try to address, become an advocate for whatever your experience was. And I think that is one of the most powerful things you can do. And just finding a community of people and other people who've been through the same thing, because you do need to have those experiences validated, and then you have something to relate to with the person. I just think that it's very important, no matter what it is, as I mentioned, that you find people to connect with and share your experiences.
Absolutely. When I had my story was in Good Housekeeping magazine back in 2002, and I had people coming up to me in the grocery store telling me their story, and that they had never told anyone else. And I had people that I had known for decades who had never told anyone, not even their spouses, because that was their secret shame. And I felt like it was just so blatantly obvious, but I was like, and later on when my girls were older, I told them the same thing. I said, this isn't any gray area. This is 100% the predator's fault and 0% your fault. this person's an adult, you're a child. You have done nothing wrong. And they need to realize that. And it just infuriates me when people try to keep that going, like, oh, don't tell anybody because they're going to think you're damaged goods, which just makes it worse. And
it makes other people scared to come forward. By speaking about it and addressing it and acknowledging it, you are making it safe for others to come forward.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, like we mentioned yesterday with the Weinstein case and with the Cosby case, once a few people have the guts to speak up, it does empower some others who have been.
It sure does, as we saw. Absolutely does. We only have like a minute left, and I really want tell people about this book, where they can get it. I mean, we've been talking about it, but where they can buy it. I want them to see your YouTube channel, anything that you can promote, your organization. Just go ahead and take a little bit of time and share that with our listeners so they can become more involved, become an advocate themselves, read your compelling books.
Okay. The Devil at My Door is published by Vandermeer Press. It's available on Amazon. And I wrote it because I wanted to empower the reader, not only to give them an interesting story, but to try to inspire and to inform and to keep these things from happening again. And along the way, some of the tricks of the trade I learned as being a PI that would have never occurred to me until I became a PI. So you get to learn a few things that way, too.
Oh, that's it. That's all we have time for. I hope you come back, Holly, and thank you so much again for having this interview with me.
Bye-bye.
See you guys next